Good evening, and welcome to the Kansas City Public Library. I'm Katie Stover, Director of Reader Services. We are very happy you could join us this evening, a date that marks a milestone in history for some and a roadblock for others. 100 years ago today, the 19th Amendment was ratified in Tennessee. On paper, it guaranteed women the right to vote, but not all women, not Black women, not other women of color. This date, this subject, would have been significant in any year. It feels far more significant since it falls during this year, an election year. And also because this has been a year of unpredictable change, unfathomable challenge, and unmitigated courage. Similar to situations faced by Ida B. Wells, Mary Church Terrell, and Mary Burnett Talbot. Tonight, Dr. Saje Mathieu will discuss the zenith and nadir of the 19th Amendment's promise for Black women. And there are few who are more qualified than Dr. Mathieu. Dr. Mathieu is an associate professor of history at the University of Minnesota. She recently completed a faculty fellowship at Harvard University's Warren Center for Studies in American History. She holds a joint PhD in history and African American studies from Yale University. Dr. Mathieu earned several international awards for her work and is a former fellow at the University of Heidelberg.
This meeting is being recorded.
And the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, to name a couple. If Dr. Mathieu looks familiar, then you were at her talk on the Red Summer of 1919 at the National World War I Museum just a year ago. Or perhaps you've seen her in two documentaries, Citizen Soldier and Blackjack Pershing, Love and War. Please welcome Dr. Saje Mathieu talking about qualified rights, women's suffrage, citizenship, and the 19th Amendment Reconsidered.
Thank you for that wonderful introduction. And thank you everyone for being here this evening. I hear it's beautiful weather in Kansas City, so it means even more to have you here with us this evening. I have been thinking a lot about what today means to me, both as a woman and as a historian. And I hope that you can join me in that contemplation. We're going to be taking questions. So please feel free to send them in writing, and I will do my best to answer them in the time that we have. But I hope that my contemplations also raise some good reflections for you too. So what I'm trying to say is that you can write in with questions or you can write in with reflections. So 100 years ago today, who could have believed then that within just 1 century, the country would see an African-American president, an African-American first lady, and 3 women, one of them African-American and Asian-American, no less, named to the vice presidential ticket, and at least 1 woman who could boast having secured the popular vote for president with nearly 63 million votes. As you know, the fight for women's rights was a long slog that bound and at times divided women all over the world. In other words, the US's refusal to vote clearly on the question of women's suffrage pointed to its shifting place on the international stage. So if modern Great Britain, Finland, Canada, Australia, and even Russia allowed their women to vote, what did it say about American women that they could not? So the question of women having the right to vote in the United States becomes a way of measuring and questioning and challenging the United States' purported modernity and its entrance on the world stage as the 20th century superpower, and an imperial one at that, as we have to remember that in those first decades of the 20th century, the US had expanded into the Philippines, into the Pacific. So on the one hand, we're trying to say that this is a big modern country that's going to tell other people, or at least model for other people, how to be. But when it comes to women's rights, we're behind other countries, and even some of those countries, smaller colonial ones like Canada and Australia. how could women, American women then, gathered at the international peace conventions or other international meetings happening in those first couple of decades of the 20th century, how could they be taken seriously when they could not even flex their own muscle at home, right? Who were these American women who didn't even have the vote? Who were they to then dictate to anyone else what the terms of their citizenship should be? So, in the event, as a reminder, in case you did, or if you did not know, when American women are on the cusp of getting the right to vote, of winning, not getting because they fought hard to get it, but earning and securing the right to vote in 1919, delayed, of course, to 1920. Here are some of the other countries that Americans traded with, interacted with, had already seen women voting for decades. New Zealand, the first country to grant women the right to vote in 1893. Australia in 1902, when it allows women to vote in federal elections. Finland in 1906, followed 2 years later with Denmark, and that includes Iceland, which was a part of Denmark at the time. And even here in the Western Hemisphere, by 1918, Canada and Trinidad and Tobago allowed women to vote. Great Britain, still in Europe, women there could vote. The United States nemesis in the Great War era, Russia, had by 1917 allowed women there to vote. So again, if you're an American woman, you're looking around the world and saying, wait a minute, autocratic Russia managed to turn things around that quickly. Women there can vote, but I still can't do so in my own country. And this surprised even me when I double checked these dates, Jamaica, Afghanistan, and Belgium, there women could vote in 1919 before Americans could vote in their own country. Women of all stripes fought for the right to exercise the full franchise. And here it's important for us to remember that, because as an American historian who teaches African American history classes about half of the time, it always strikes me that we still segregate how we tell the story of this country. So, in other words, we hear about Mary Church Terrell and Ida B. Wells. We hear about them repeatedly in African American history classes, not so much in an American history class or even a women's history class. And it's important to cross-pollinate, right? We also don't hear so much about Stanton in an African American history class. So here then is our opportunity while we contemplate the meaning of this centenary. It's an opportunity for us to remember that women of all stripes fought for the right for the full franchise, though their motivations often differed greatly. So too did their rationales, when the rationales that they presented for the urgency of their causes. So whatever the case, the right to vote always proved a bare knuckle brawl, so often resulting in women being beaten, threatened, their children and spouses assaulted, their sanity and moralities questioned, and their lives sometimes taken. So whether you were white, whether you were Black, whether you were Asian, whether you were Native American, at no point was it a simple and safe thing to do to question the status quo when it came to your second-class citizenship. Women of all stripes endured the full force of the state and the brunt of their countrymen's hate, and yet still they persisted. So here, I think of the women, the Black women, for example, who made the case for the import of the vote, citing the need for anti-lynching legislation, the ability to vote people into office who would halt the catastrophic impact of lynching on Black communities. And some of those women were killed for doing so. As we note the 100th anniversary and the quest of women's quest for full citizenship and human rights, it seems most important to me that we interrogate, challenge, if you will, what exactly we celebrate on this day. When we say women got the vote 100 years ago, are we once again operating from a white normative gaze and lived experience and assuming or presuming the same for all other women? Women of color stood on the sidelines on this day 100 years ago, figuratively and actually, as few of them were invited to be part of parades of chapeaued white women marching, yellow roses coating their chests. These elite white women, many of them urban progressive reformers, assumed with that vote the right to speak for many, and equally important, the right to silence many more. Some white women who, 100 years ago today, could finally vote and saw that as a tremendous win, forgot that for so many other women who also fought for the right to vote, the battle had simply changed. It had not yet ended. Some white women, it's important for us to remember, used their vote as a cudgel with which to hold the line on race, on xenophobia, on class distinction, on Protestantism, on regional supremacy, the idea that only urban educated women could dictate the correct status of women. So women in urban areas were simply not modern enough or unable to define for themselves what their needs would be. We get a powerful example of how some white women made the case for the vote and then used their vote in order to uphold and even solidify white supremacy in the 1920s and 30s. What I mean by that is, of course, the argument that we see as early as the 1860s by some white women who will say that if men got the vote, then that meant that Black men could vote. And if Black men could vote, then as a society, we were in effect voting that Black men's words, needs, rights were more important than white women's words, needs, and rights. And if Black men were given access to the polls, they would use that access in strictly nefarious ways when it came to white women. They could, for example, vote to make lawful assault on white women, what Stanton called or predicted would be a dramatic and terrifying uptick in the outrage of white women language for the 1920s that usually meant rape, right? Another word that we often get in the teens and 20s for especially Black men aggressing white women was to say that, one had been jazzed. And so some white women understood, made the powerful case for their right to the vote by saying that they had to have it as a weapon, as a shield against violent Black male bodies in particular. And so we have to really think about how women who could vote as of 1920, how they then used that power to reinforce their pre-existing privilege, whether that's race-based in terms of class, in terms of religion, in terms of citizenship. It's too simple to just say women got the right to vote, all is good, happy ending for everyone, onward. White women voted for some truly awful stuff and did it fully cognizant of the impact of their actions. They used their vote to deny and rob other people of color from their rights, their spouses' rights to life, their children's right to a good education, everyone's right to live wherever they wanted, and some would even say to marry whoever they loved. And it's not to say by even sort of bringing this up that white women didn't do some truly spectacular things with their vote. Of course they did. We all get to benefit from that. But it's not enough to just look at the side of the exercise of that vote for ways that reinforce how we feel good about our own sort of narrower experiences. Who were these women who fought for other women's right to vote? We certainly have lots of pictures of women in fabulous outfits, playing the public part of perfect femininity in the sort of tail end of the Victorian age and the post World War I era. But in actuality, women who dared to stand in the public square and demand that they be treated as full citizens, women who picketed, who voiced, who criticized their governments when it was never safe to do so during World War I, were, in today's parlance, in terms that mean something concrete, these were non-conforming women, right? They were savvy political actors. They understood that they had to cultivate different allies, that they had to continue to make use of the tools that were available to them. And so often that was the use of the press, the use of language that affirmed the importance of motherhood, for example. Um, a lot of these women were educated women, ones who had been were able enough and fortunate enough to get a university education when that was not normative for any Americans, never mind women. They were often single women, which is, again, not conforming behavior for the era that we're talking about, right? The 1910s, the 1920s. The average American family is 8 children. So to say that you want to be single and not have children is it's super counter to the norm. And a lot of these women were queer women, women who were gay but could not live their lives as such. And yet they fought for all women's rights and were not always the first wave of winners of the rights that, you know, other women could benefit from. And these queer women were oftentimes also abandoned when it was their turn to fight for rights that were more immediately pertinent to their lived experiences. So today is, at least for me, an opportunity to reflect on both the successes and the setbacks made possible when 100 years ago, some women could hold their heads up high when they sashayed into a voting booth. Most of them, which, we have to also, especially during the election period that we are in, how could we have possibly forget that the vote is the most important step to secure all of one's rights as a citizen. Voting determines who will sit on your school boards, who will be the judges who then decide on people's lives, who can who will win a primary, who will get to sit on Congress. All kinds of smaller scale municipal decisions are being made by the ability to vote. So when women 100 years ago won their fight to finally be allowed to vote, they won control over their lives. They won control over their families. They won control over their bodies. Not full control, but the ability to change how they would fight for that control. And that's huge. They also won the ability to have a counter to the singular level that was their husband's power within the family, right? So, if their husbands voted in one direction, those women could nullify that vote by voting in a different direction. If their husbands didn't bother to go and vote, those women could still take action in defense of their families. And that's super important. 100 years ago, by securing the right to vote, women took sure-footed steps into the polity, that contested terrain from which women were meant to be permanently banished. In so doing, they brought to that arena table table politics, right? That reinforced the value of children, workers, mothers, men's needs, veterans' needs. So, in other words, once women became part of the broader political discussion and had a voice, a lever that they could pull, that made real, that you had to take them into account, they brought with them, or they increased the volume on the needs of the people that women took care of on a daily basis. Women of color, whether they could vote or could not vote, did all of those things as well. So they too saw the vote as something that allowed them to defend their families in all the ways that I've described, and in additional ways as a function of being women of color. So, against racial violence, for example. So I'm just going to take a few minutes and sort of raise some ways in which the vote maybe meant different things for different women of color. If you were Chinese American, and I mean very specifically Chinese American, the vote was a way for that constituency to challenge once more all of the ways in which their country simply said over and over, you are not and cannot ever be a citizen. The vote allowed Chinese American women to have a say in laws that addressed the sexual assault and exploitation that some of them experienced. And we get some wonderful cases, especially out of California. The vote was a way of waving off the xenophobic policies that were being directed very specifically at Asian American women. If you are a Chicana woman living in America, a Mexican American woman, the vote is a way of pushing back against abuses and misdeeds at the border. So ways in which we question continually whether these people are in fact citizens, whether they are fit to be citizens, whether they are entitled to all of the rights of citizenship. And so the vote becomes yet another way for Mexican Americans to say, yes, we are here. Yes, we are citizens. Yes, you will take us seriously, and we will make our presence known at the voting booth. For Native American women, this day is a complicated one. They are not even recognized as citizens in their own land in 1920. It will not be until 1924 when the Native American Act finally acknowledges a sliver of Native American humanity, far too delayed and far too narrow in scope, but at least it is then that those women could voice their urgent needs. And it's important for us to remember that in 1920, Native American communities are absolutely savaged by the flu, ravaged. They experienced the worst numbers, the worst devastation when it comes to the pandemic, and were effectively overlooked. So 1920 for Native American women, it's a busy time. They're actually trying to rescue, save their families, and they are left out. The 19th Amendment demonstrates once more how they are completely left out of the conversation. White immigrant women, even those white immigrant women that we weren't sure were white in 1920, the vote is not yet theirs. It's unclear how it is theirs. It is unclear how the vote will be used to push them to the margins, right? Is it enough to be in the United States to then have the right to vote? We will say that it is not, that immigrants have to jump a few more hoops. But the vote is important for those women when they do have it and where they have it, because 1920 to 1925 is the high watermark of English only laws being passed, and different ways in which we are once again using the laws and women's inability to push back against those laws as a way of demonstrating who belongs and who does not. And of course, for African American women, the group I'd like to finish with today, the vote is so important because it will allow them to defend their families, save their babies, right? African American communities, then, as they do now, have alarming infant death rates. And for these Black women, they feel that this is an important social cause and they need to be heard. They need to support candidates who will vote for better medical services. Black women will make the case for the import of the vote as a way of protecting Black immigrants. And we forget that immigrants from the Caribbean are coming to the United States, immigrants from Africa are coming from the United States, Afro Latinos are coming, chiefly from Panama, and some Black Canadians are also coming to the United States. And it is an era of xenophobia, and Black women understand, especially Ida B. Wells, that it's important to protect these migrants. Of course, education matters. It always will for Black women. And they're concerned about protecting their brothers, uncles, husbands, fathers' rights as veterans from World War I. And the vote will be an important way for them to do that. And lastly, the last two things that are probably very important for Black women when making the case for access to the vote will be better access to housing, fair access to housing, concerns that exist today. And lastly, certainly most importantly, an end to lynching, a problem that is only gaining steam. And Black women want to be able to vote in order to vote for people who will pass anti-lynching legislation and vote out people who oppose anti-lynching legislation. So I suppose if I had to pick a short way of explaining what today means to me, I would say that it's a celebration of how far we've come in 100 years. We've come in ways that, 100 years ago, they could not have imagined, like what I started with, the idea that we would even have a Black woman and an Asian woman running for vice president of the United States within not 100 years, but 50 years of those women being able to vote with fewer impediments. That's incredible. That's truly, in my book, incredible. I understand that it might not be in everyone's book. I think that it's important to think of today as an absolutely important milestone, but a milestone, not the end of the road. For so many women, nearly half of the women in the country, at least women of color and working class white women, working class urban women, rural women, today was not the end of a road. It was an opening up of that road, right? It was a way of now adding yet another quiver with another arrow to the quiver and saying then we can fight with yet another weapon for ensuring our full place in our own country. So the right to vote for Black women, and by extension, other women of color, really happens in 1965, not in 1920. Because in 1920, white supremacist laws throughout the South and even in some Midwestern and Northern parts of the United States still made it an incredibly dangerous, if not altogether impossible thing for Black women to walk into a voting booth and voice their discontent. On that fine note, I shall end here and be happy to answer your questions.
Thanks, Sage. I'm going to throw back to something that we were talking about in the green room.
Sure.
When I was asking you the difference between the 15th Amendment and the 19th Amendment, and it seemed that when I read them, citizen is an obvious word to me, and it was an obvious word to Susan B. Anthony, and not obvious enough, evidently, because we have the 19th Amendment. But can you share why we had to get to the 19th Amendment because of that?
Sure. I think that we imagine now that the debate about who gets to vote, or that we pass a law and it's super clear that we mean everyone, right? That's not at all how people thought about it in the mid 19th century. That when African Americans are, for example, freed or given their freedom, it isn't clear that that means that they can vote. We realize that it doesn't mean that at all, right? That we then have to fight for the right to vote and get a clarification with the 15th Amendment. But the 15th, we had by the late 19th century become really, really good at crafting laws that rarely explicitly mentioned race and never mentioned gender, and assume that it was clear who we actually meant those laws to be for, right? So the 15th Amendment barely makes clear that the vote applies to Black people, and it makes very clear that it does not apply to women, because the few women who did try to vote learned the hard way that it did not mean that law was intended for them, right? So it's precisely because we've become so good at crafting laws that danced around constituencies that we need the 19th Amendment to make it explicit that the vote applies to women as well. And in so doing, we clarify that women are not children, because by this point, those were the only other sort of large categories of Americans who could not vote.
We have an audience question.
Sure.
Someone in our viewing audience wants to know, in terms of impact,
Yes.
how do you compare the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to the 19th Amendment?
The Voting Rights Act, one could argue that it's even bigger. And I think that that would be a presentist understanding of the Voting Rights Act. I think the 19th Amendment is an absolute earthquake in terms of American life. We're saying that women have a thought and we might want to listen to it, right? It opens up the possibility, anyway, for a time that maybe it really meant more than just white women. We need the 1965 Voting Act precisely because we failed at the full potential that the 19th Amendment could have delivered. So I think they're equally important. They broadened the aperture for all women. The 1965 Voting Rights Act broadens it for all women, but it doesn't, it is perfecting what was already a huge transformation in American political life, and that is the 19th Amendment. I hope that makes sense.
Yes, everything you're saying makes sense. You are the history professor I wish I had when I was in undergrad school.
In a few weeks, we'll see if my students still feel that way when we start classes.
I can't imagine they would.
I have a former student here with me tonight, so who knows how he feels. I shall have to ask when we're done with this talk.
We have someone else in the audience who wants to know, where do voting rights rank in the hierarchy of rights? Obviously, we're still waiting for an equal rights amendment, and we're still fighting for equal pay. Reproductive rights are not guaranteed. So did the right to vote have to come first? And why are we still waiting on all these other things?
I think that the right to vote is absolutely everything. And so did civil rights activists a half century later. It is the right to vote protects almost absolutely everything we do from the moment we open our eyes in the morning until we close them at night, right? Because it means that we get to, we vote in or we vote out the people who determine everything that we do. And while a lot of attention is paid at federal elections, because those are the sexy, exciting ones, right? The televised ones. In actuality, voting for municipal offices are so much more, have so much greater an impact on our daily lives. And it's an exercise I do in my classes, in my civil rights classes, where I have the students sort of think about that. Go find out what a comptroller does. Go find out who decides when school starts and when school ends, and who has street lights and who does not, and who has sidewalks, and whose roads get shoveled when it snows, something that matters tremendously to Minnesotans, right? So voting is huge. It is the way that we say, I do every few years, right? So that voting, in fact, it is precisely because voting is so important, in my opinion, the most important right, that so much energy in terms of the state and in terms of individuals is poured into perverting that right, undermining that right, making that right dangerous to exercise, dangerous to even think about. The subversion of women and people of color's rights and poor white people's rights is it's really an abomination if you think about it for the 20th century. We see it at play right now. I mean, the idea that we would mess with the mail, something that most of us don't even think about, as a way of exercising in a passive aggressive, or perhaps more honestly, aggressive way of letting people vote, voice their needs. To me, I can't think of a right that's bigger than that, because we get to vote who decides what we can do with our bodies.
That's
All of it, from what pills we can and cannot put in our bodies, when in, you know, we get to vote who decides how much pain we can endure before we want to say that life, maybe it's time to end it. We vote who decides what is a crime and what isn't a crime. And it is precisely because women have not been able to exercise their rights, their right to vote, unencumbered, unfettered, that we still discuss, that we have a Me Too moment happening, right? That we still discuss what is and isn't a crime when it comes to women's bodies, what is and isn't transgressive. Um, it seems to me that I mean, as a woman, I think that reminds me why, no matter the weather, no matter the line, I will vote every time.
I agree. I do too. For you want to throw an election, I will be there if I'm allowed to vote.
When you know what, this reminds me of an article I read that I absolutely loved, and it was about Black women at the turn of the 20th century in the South, before they had been completely run out of voting booths, and how when they could vote, they would go, and we saw this again later during the civil rights period. They would bring a gun in their purses when they went to vote. And there's a fabulous quote in one of the readings that I have, where the grandmother is, and it's the grandmother's job to teach the children. In this instance, in this reading, it's the boys. They happen to be little boys. And she takes them with her to the voting booth, and she explains that she's packing a gun in case she has to fight her way to the booth. But she's also bringing them, in their Sunday best, because she wants them to see what it means to exercise that right. And I think that's really powerful. I think, if you watch women vote today, they still bring their children, and they don't even know why. I hope they're not bringing guns, but, they're bringing their children. And it's because they took seriously teaching that right, modeling that right, and making clear for their children, the next generations, the cost of exercising that right.
We have several questions coming in from
Sure.
the audience. This is great. Are there any specifics you can point to that explain why the U.S. was noticeably behind the curve in giving women the right to vote?
Well, I mean, socialism. Really, the countries that see, I mean, at least the European countries that vote, that are quicker to granting women the right to vote, either have a high socialist or active socialist organizations that are pushing for all kinds of revolution. So against that background of like ousting a king altogether, maybe letting women vote is not so bad. It's an easier concession, toppling autocracy altogether. And then it's also in countries where, like in the case of Finland and Denmark, where the war has the impact of the war, either going to the war or coming out of the war, has meant an absence of young men, right? And so we need women to speak for those men while they are at war. So those are the main reasons that we see this in Europe. Now, in a slight defense of the United States here, when Great Britain decides that it will finally, after brutal repression of women there too, acknowledge women's right to vote, because of its imperial reach, then Canada, Australia, New Zealand quickly fall into place as well, right? So in that instance, I mean, I don't want to belittle the effort of women, even in my own country of Canada. They were working towards that as well, but when it really tips over in the US, then it follows everywhere else. And the United States, I suppose their exceptionalism stands out here too.
How ironic is it that as we celebrate the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, that Kamala Harris would have been among the women still disenfranchised after its passage and ratification?
Yes, indeed, right? Or that in an embarrassing cliche, her citizenship is being questioned because she's Asian, right? Because her parents were immigrants. So the same sort of xenophobic knee-jerk reactions. Or I shouldn't even say her citizenship there's a pathetic attempt at questioning her citizenship. I don't think it's an actual question. But the trope works, right? The button is still there and we can lean into it. So yeah, there are all kinds of ways in which, the women who 100, 120, 150 years ago thought that it was almost a crazy idea to make the case for the vote, who were laughed out of rooms, beat out of rooms, I think they'd be really tickled today. They'd be tickled in part because it took several centuries to get to the 19th Amendment, and it took 100 years to get to the White House.
And we have another question came in through a different channel.
Sure.
How should we celebrate the Centennial knowing that it wasn't inclusive?
I say celebrate. We can't, it's not an all or nothing world. It just isn't. It's really, it's really naive. It's really oversimplified to think that it has to be perfect. We think we're doing wonderful things right now that people will just skewer us for. And the way that I put it in my classes, I adore dogs. I mean, I like dogs more than people. I'm one of those. And I think of myself as a great dog owner. They eat well, they sleep comfortably, they have a beautiful life. And I leave my home every day sure that I'm great, because, not only do I have a leash so they're safe, but it's an expensive, fabulous, dog-friendly leash. And so I'm like, yeah, this is love. I've got this one by the throat. And in 100 years, they might say, how awful were these people who thought they loved their pets, but walked around with a noose around their necks, right? But my dogs who are rescued, I think it's a win. Their lives are so much better. I'm not reducing anyone to dogs. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that from a time when we didn't have any regard for animals' lives to now, like, living at a time where they have organic meals picked by a left-handed Sherpa, like, who gazed over the thing as it grew. I mean, like, it's ridiculous, right? In a lot of ways. So we've made some progress, and we're working with what we know, and we're making all kinds of mistakes, but we're headed in the right direction. And I think that that's important. The Black women who went to meetings and stood up each time they knew they would be shouted out of those meetings didn't continue to show up because they thought yeah, I'm doing this because I only want white women to get ahead. They saw white women having some kind of win in 1920 as a promise for what could happen if they continued to show up at meetings, if they continued to stand up at meetings, if they continued to say, women, I agree with you on these three things, but on these other four things, there's room for growth. So I say celebrate, and maybe celebrate even more in these COVID times. We have so much that we cannot celebrate. So I'm glad for those badass ladies from 1920. I am, who I described, these kitten heeled women who did all kinds of pretty smart ways to make sure that they got heard, and who took those beatings and stood up again and again and again. I benefit from what they did, even if in other ways it took longer for me to benefit from what they did.
We're looking forward to benefiting from, I hope, election later on here in Missouri. Kansas City's own Alicia Kennedy is running for lieutenant governor. And a lot of people have been shocked to learn that Missouri has never elected a Black Missourian to statewide office, let alone a Black woman.
And
So
like,
obviously,
why are they surprised? That always makes me laugh. Like, why? It's only been 50 years. It's not like there are a gajillion. So good, let them be surprised and then reflect on that. Right?
do you see evidence that that we're taking that next step from having a diverse collective of voters to actually electing diverse representation?
Um, the cynic in me says we have to. There are good and bad people who come in every color, and so we may elect some people of color who are just as awful as everybody else who's been in that office. And so having a diverse, having people who represent us, who look and speak for the range of experiences, is important. And so for me, I mean, I'm not sure that color is the singular thing that I look for a win. I think that we owe a lot to queer women. We owe a lot to these women who have not yet forced us to consider more carefully how much we owe them. So I might, maybe the diversity will be more important there for me. I don't know. I mean, I kind of feel like there's so much work to do, but I'll take it on good faith. So if we elect people of all kinds of backgrounds, I will assume the best, and I will hold them to the same standard of excellence that I've expected of everybody else in office. And if they fall short of that, then I shall put on my own kitten heels and head to the voting booth.
Questions keep pouring in. We have an audience member who wants to know, is there another legislative or even constitutional step to take, or is further progress simply societal?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that, please?
Is there another legislative or even constitutional step to take, or is further progress simply societal?
I think we will be seeing more cases at the Supreme Court level. We need more courageous people in office to stop the gerrymandering, to stop all of the ways that we suppress people's votes. And if we look at the income levels of people, we catch a lot of people in that net in terms of who is being suppressed. Where I live, in a very wealthy suburb of Minneapolis, there's no line. If it weren't COVID times, there'd be a cappuccino machine. I mean, it's just absolute comfort and no trouble at all. And then in other places, people are losing wages. It's all trouble to vote. So I think we need more courageous people in office who say enough is enough. but we know that the incentives are great to not do that.
Make it easier for folks to vote. I mean, we talk in libraries about meeting the public where they are.
Yes.
Same thing with voting. Meet the constituents where they are.
If I Google something and then I'm now bombarded with commercials, like clearly you know where to find me, right? I can't get Bed Bath and Beyond to stop stalking me. So clearly you know where to find me. I don't even understand why I can't vote anywhere in town when it's all digitized anyway, right? So if you could vote wherever you live, like anywhere in your city, people could vote while they're at work. Like you could, so there are so many ways in which we are not marshaling our technological capabilities to make the vote easier for people instead of harder. So I got a question, and that is, do I see any parallels between the current attempts at voter suppression and the refusal of enfranchisement granted by the 19th Amendment? And absolutely, right? Absolutely. I mean, just because women could vote, it doesn't follow that they were welcomed to vote. And that's not just at a state level, but even within families, right? Some husbands said, I don't care what the Constitution says. No wife of mine is going to be seen, right, among these radicals standing in line with pantaloons on voting day. So yeah, there are deliberate, coercive, pernicious attempts to limit the vote today, just as we had them in 1920 and 1930 and 1940 and 1960. So, and again, to make my point, it is precisely because the vote is so dangerous.
Can you compare the resistance we see today when it comes to efforts to make voting easier to the previous efforts to keep women and Black Americans from being able to vote?
Can you move a little for me, please? Yeah, there we go. These automatic lights, if you don't move, then they turn off. Sorry about that. Yes, I think that we're going to see a lot of violence at voting locations in this election this November. And there was some violence, I think, in the 1920s when women tried to vote. Some women were still having things thrown at them, bottles, rotten fruits and vegetables, they were blocked from trying to have access. And of course, in the case of Black women, we know some were lynched, certainly tarred and feathered, and not just in the 1920s. So it's like I said at the beginning, it's always been a bare knuckle fight, and I don't think it's going to stop.
We hope that we're living in times when we will see that it stops.
I mean,
that voter suppression
might be that we have ways now, and we can vote by mail. We can vote. I voted online when I was living in Germany. I didn't even know that was a thing, but yes, my ballot was sent to me in my email. So we have ways to stay safe, to stay in safe places and still vote, right? So you can vote from home if home is a safe space. We should exercise those rights before they are creatively taken away, before we fully contemplated their potential. So I think most people had never considered voting from home. And before they've had a chance to think about it, we're talking about getting rid of it, vilifying it, undermining it. So, but what we know as women is the sure way to ensure that we do something is like piss us off. I might walk all the way to the post office to put my ballot in the mail in a way that I might have not given as much thought before. I might have just, throw it in the first box I see. But it will mean something different to me when I deliver that piece of paper this year. So I think that, yeah, there's a way in which we can be reminded that the work is not finished, even in 2020. And I think that would make the women who fought for the 19th Amendment really, really happy. that we're not sort of resting on our laurels. So
And we'll continue the work in
we'll
November.
continue the work. And then in, 40, 50 years, our children will tell us how we did it all wrong.
But we'll have shown
Now
them
they
how
can
to
do
fix
it better.
We'll have shown them how to fix it.
Indeed. And left the gun behind.
That's
Just
right.
bring the purse.
Don't need that.
So,
Well, Sage,
thank
this has been wonderful. Thank you so much for joining us
you for
tonight.
having me. I'm glad it all worked out.
I am too, and sharing your expertise, especially on today of all days. This amendment and this evening's event are strong reminders that every voice counts, every vote counts. And I would ask our audience to please honor these women by registering to vote and casting a ballot.
And bring some friends.
Bring some friends. Okay,
So, thank you.
you all. Good night.
Good night.